In this lecture, I want to shift the focus back to the capital of Constantinople and back to the court of the Sultan. We spent 3 lectures dealing with the various frontiers and how important they were for the Ottoman state, and we brought the narrative down to about the middle of the 17th century. We also talked a great deal about the succession problems earlier in the course, leading to all of those weak sultans that climaxed in 1640 with the accession of Crazy Ibrahim, or as he's often known as Ibrahim Deli in Turkish. In September of 1656, the then ruling Sultan, Mehmet IV, summoned a man who was about 72 or 73 years of age. He's known as Mehmet Köprülü. Köprülü is treated in Western sources often as a last name, but it's really an indication of where he came from. Köprü is the Turkish name for the modern city of Veles, today in Macedonia, and he was from an Albanian family that had converted to Islam sometime in the 16th century, and he had entered Ottoman service, and he ends up being one of the most unlikely reformers of the Ottoman state. Mehmet Köprülü established a very important dynasty of Grand Viziers who would address the issues that emerged out of these rather ruinous wars that we've talked about in the last 3 lectures. That includes the costly wars on the eastern frontier against the Safavids, the wars in Central Europe against the Habsburgs, later against Poland, Lithuania, and above all, that costly naval war that climaxed at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. The Ottoman state had been bankrupt repeatedly from the 1590s on. The currency had been depreciated. The Ottomans could not issue a successful currency of their own. Foreign coins circulated in lieu very often of Ottoman money. And really, the Ottoman state did much of its calculation in Venetian gold ducats rather than its own currency. In addition, the household had gotten out of hand, the harem had become a major political force, the janissaries had become increasingly politicized, and the result is the position of the Sultan had declined steadily over the 17th century. The Sultan Mad Ibrahim, or Ibrahim Deli, was a very, very unfortunate choice. He had been put on the throne by his mother, the notorious Kursan Sultan, who had manipulated the succession for the last generation. In 1648, he was finally retired, and his son, Sultan Mehmet IV, was proclaimed the new Sultan. Now, this was another typical palace revolution. It put on the throne a very, very young sultan who, of course, would be in the hands of his grand viziers and, above all, his mother, Turhan Hatice, who had manipulated a good deal of the court to put her son on the throne and to retire Mad Ibrahim. The result is that this young sultan, when he was proclaimed ruler, initially he thought he was going to be taken out of the kafis, the cage, and strangled, that there had been some sort of abortive plot, and was actually astonished when he was brought to the divan and proclaimed sultan. He had never been prepared really for the position, and as he matured, he became very, very suspicious of plots. He was always worried about being upstaged by his various brothers. He had a number of half-brothers. He would be followed by them as the successors, Suleiman and Ahmed, and yet he made a very, very important appointment in 1656 to summon Mehmet Köprülü to head up a major reform of the Ottoman state. And this Albanian Grand Vizier brought about a remarkable revival of Ottoman power and administration and ended the political instability within the House of Osman. Mehmet Köprülü is a very significant figure, not only for the revival he conducted and the dynasty of able Albanian ministers he established, but he also represented a new type of Ottoman bureaucrat. He entered the Sultan's service essentially in the kitchen, the mutfak. He was a pastry chef. He eventually made his way up to cook. And he came to the attention of the Grand Viziers, and he served under 4 different Grand Viziers in his long career. He was given a Timur when he was about age 20, which in effect elevated him into the askari, that is, into the military administrative class that put him on par with the Janissaries. But he wasn't really a product of the old Janissary system. The Devshirme, as you recall, had been discontinued in the reign of Sultan Murad IV. He ruled from 1623 to 1640. And increasingly, the bureaucrats and officials of the Sublime Porte, as well as the people who administered the court and the harem, were coming from a new Muslim bureaucratic class. And these were people who had come out of the Medrese schools. And they included many men of provincial background, particularly Albanians, Bosniaks, that is, Muslims from the Balkans, who took service either in the palace or as scribes or part of the expanded administrative class. And they were all men who bought the whole Ottoman system. Mehmet Kurpuli was devoted to the Sultan and to his position as caliph in the Islamic world. In his training, he very, very much saw the whole development of history along the lines of what I discussed in a previous lecture that goes back to the traditions of Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun was the great historical thinker of the early 14th century who saw dynastic history almost as a medical analogy, that dynasties would rise and fall, that they would become ill, and there was always the possibility of restoring the health of the victim. And in Mehmet's mind, reform was, in effect, a medical effort to return the Sultanate back to its pristine form, to bring it back to health. And that included a very, very rigorous moral program, appointment of men who were capable and loyal to the Sultan, devoted to the traditions of not only Sunni Islam, but the position that the Sultan was also caliph. And so much of the reforms of Mehmet, as well as his sons who followed, his son-in-laws, really centered around finding the proper personnel to carry out the directives of the Sultan and the court. Another important aspect of this reform movement was the moral tone and standards that were set for all bureaucrats, a level of honesty and efficiency, a tradition to protect the Ria, that is, the non-military classes, whether they be Muslim or dhimmi, that is, the non-believers, from the rapacious activities of either officials or soldiers. And that, too, was a very, very important notion embedded in the Ottoman tradition of Sharia. And to a large extent, these Albanian Grand Viziers succeeded. They were able to set new standards, new conduct of bureaucratic efficiency and morality that helped a great deal to regenerate the effectiveness of the House of Osman, and won a great deal of favor from the local notables who dominated the cities and the tax farming system throughout the empire. And that's no small achievement that must be stressed. Mehmet established a dynasty of Grand Viziers that would dominate the political life of the capital down to 1711. He was followed by two sons, his older Ahmed, often called Fazil Ahmed, meaning the smart Ahmed, and then a later second son, Mustafa, was also Grand Vizier. Two son-in-laws, particularly the older of the two, Kara Mustafa, turned out to be also very important Grand Viziers. In a period of about 55 years, 45 years of it was dominated by members of this family. But what is more significant is not only the positions of Grand Viziers, but many of the officials and officers in the Janissaries were appointed by father and son, Mehmet and Ahmet Kurpuli, and they carried the same values that the Grand Viziers did. So in many ways, the administrative and moral legacy of the Kurpuli Viziers lasted deep into the 18th century and very much characterized the positions of later sultans, particularly the Sultan Ahmed III, that we'll be discussing him in a later lecture. Now, the importance of this family cannot be exaggerated. They really carried out significant reforms in the empire and gave a new life to the authority of the Sultan, even though the Sultan was largely a figurehead. Now, in 1656, the reason that the Sultan Mehmet IV had summoned this Albanian minister was the empire was going bankrupt in another war. In 1645, the crazy Sultan Ibrahim Ibrahim in Ottoman Turkish, Abraham in English, had been convinced to declare war on Venice. At the time, Europe was locked in the 30 Years' War, and it looked like an easy picking. The capture of Venice would bolster a regime that was really had major publicity problems, and it was thought that the Venetians could be easily conquered, and the island of Crete, which was the last Venetian stronghold in the Aegean, would be promptly captured. And in 1645, a huge Ottoman army was landed and put the city of Candia under siege. And this siege would last on and off until 1669. The war proved far more costly than anyone had imagined, and the Venetians responded with their navy. And what happened is the Venetian navy swept the Ottoman fleet out of the Aegean, interdicted transportation going to Constantinople, so grain shipments from Egypt were interrupted. Of course, the pilgrimage trade was interrupted. The Venetians themselves could not change the situation in Crete, but they could supply their garrison at Candia. The war turned out to be enormously expensive for both sides. By the time it was over, the Venetian Republic was nearly broke. Something like 4.3 million gold ducats was spent just on the defense of Candia alone, and that would today be the modern city of Heraklion, the principal city in Crete. On the other hand, there had been so much resentment, especially in the coastal areas of Asia Minor, as more and more men were called up for military service as well as service in the fleet. So in 1656, the war had really gotten out of hand, and it was hoped that this new Grand Vizier could solve the problem. And sure enough, Mehmet Korkuli managed to put together a great fleet in the next year. It swept the Venetians out of the Sea of Marmara, entered the Aegean, and shifted the balance in the war. Eventually, the Ottomans, after a siege of almost 2 years of continuous blockade, would force Venice to the negotiating table, and the island of Crete was finally taken over by the Ottoman state. It was, however, a devastated island and a rather hollow victory, but it had ended the ruinous war. It also made the reputation of the Korkuli family. At the same time, in dealing with Venice, there were also problems on the northwestern frontier. Fortunately for the port at this period, the situation to the east was stable. Neither the Shahs of Iran nor the Ottoman Sultan wanted to revive the treaty arrangements of 1639, which I had mentioned earlier were very, very sensible treaty alignments and boundaries in the east. Instead, the threat came from the north. And again, it was the problem of supervising those Christian client states, especially Transylvania. The Ottoman vassal, his name is George Rakoski, he was the Prince of Transylvania. He had aspirations to become the King of Hungary. He interfered in a great war between Charles X and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, in which George presented himself as the King of Poland. He allied with Sweden and eventually threatened to create a whole new power base outside of his position in Transylvania. All of this was against the interests of the Korkuli family running Constantinople. First, George was a vassal who had waged war without permission, had accepted a throne without Ottoman permission, and furthermore, it got more and more complicated as the Ottomans tried to intervene. They eventually had to send in an army to clear out George and then to put a vassal on the throne of Transylvania. The Hungarian exiles ran, of all places, to Vienna. The then ruling HRE, Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, refused to give him back, and the result was a brief border war in Hungary that climaxed in a significant military defeat, the Battle of St. Gothard in 1664, where the Ottoman army took an embarrassing defeat, and quickly the new Grand Vizier, Ahmed Korkuli, negotiated a treaty known as the Treaty of Varsar, which is essentially an armistice for 20 years, a timeout. And the outstanding questions between the Habsburg and the Ottoman states were settled for now. There was also a need to intervene to the northeast. And again, this was part of the fallout of the problem of supervising these rather unruly client Christian rulers in Moldavia and Transylvania. And in 1672, 1676, Ahmet Kupurli, with a very, very reluctant Sultan Mehmet IV, waged a war in Moldavia that ended up in the annexation of Polaudia, a very, very important province of southeastern Poland-Lithuania. And as a result, by 1676, the borders were stabilized, and for the first time, Ottoman power in Central Europe had actually been advanced. And this period, under the Kupurlis, actually represents the fullest, greatest extent of the Ottoman state, because the borders had been pushed into southern Poland, the borders had been defined in Hungary, and the result was that when the second Grand Vizier died in 1676, the son-in-law of Mehmet Kupurli took over as the third Grand Vizier of this family. And he was the third Kupurli Grand Vizier for Mehmet IV. His name is Kara Mustafa, the Black Mustafa. He had married into the Kupurli family. His career in many ways was similar to that of his father-in-law and brother-in-law. And he imposed himself on Mehmet IV, who as a sultan was really a rather lackluster figure. He was far more interested in hunting than he was in war. He spent a great deal of the time worrying about various plots. And the rumor was that he was a little mentally defective, not as crazy as his father was, and that he had suffered an injury as a child when his father and his mother got into a dispute, and apparently the infant Mehmet IV was actually thrown into a cistern in the Topkapi Palace and was retrieved. Whatever the case was, Kara Mustafa came to power with the expectation that he would direct the Ottoman state just as his two predecessors had. And he had inherited an extremely well-reformed administration, an efficient bureaucracy, the tax farming system was operating quite well, and above all, the borders were secure. However, he was determined to extend the power of the Ottoman state just as his predecessors, and that is to bring the power of the Ottoman state deeper into Europe, particularly against the Habsburg foe. And here, an opportune moment, or as the Ottomans would say, a red apple, a Kızıl Elma, fell into his lap. The truce that had been agreed upon back on August 10th, 1664, the so-called Peace of Varsar, Vasvar, the Peace of Vasvar, that had stipulated that the treaty would run for 20 years. And so the expiration date was 1684. However, the opportunity emerged 2 years before the expiration date that Kara Mustafa could interfere and really carry a turnabout on the northwestern frontier in Hungary. In 1682, a major rebellion broke out in Transylvania that was largely directed against the Habsburgs who had been interfering in Transylvania. It was headed up by Calvinists and Lutherans who did not want to go under the Catholic King of Hungary and Austria, then Leopold I. And the ruler, Imre Tholoki, turned to the Ottoman state for assistance as a dutiful vassal to beat back Austro-Hungarian attacks launched from Vienna. And again, at issue was Buda and his strategic position on that northwestern frontier. In addition, King Louis XIV of France also sent envoys to encourage a war between the Habsburgs and the Ottomans because Louis had ambitions in the Rhineland, and this ran him right up against Habsburg interest. And so all of these reports of the Christian divisions, the possibility of support, led Kara Mustafa to revive a project which had eluded Suleiman the Magnificent, and that is the capture of Vienna and the end of the Habsburg threat. Now, this was a very, very ambitious operation, and it's different from the operations that had been carried out by Suleiman. In 1529, it's clear that the siege conducted by Suleiman was a punitive expedition. It lasted only 19 days. Suleiman did not put his reputation or throne at risk. Essentially, he pulled out because of bad weather, and he lacked heavy artillery because of the unseasonable rains. In 1532, and again in 1566, he never made it to Vienna because of resistance at secondary fortresses. And thereafter, later sultans did not see Vienna as essential. In the 16th century, Vienna was a rather provincial town. It was one of a number of possible capitals of the Habsburgs. And it was only beginning to develop as a major city in the Habsburg domains, and really that development was in the future. Kara Mustafa had it in his mind that he would trump Suleiman I by taking Vienna and essentially destroying Habsburg power. And he convinced Mehmed IV that this was an operation to succeed. Now, given what his brother-in-law and his father-in-law had done, the father-in-law had ended the war in Crete, had ended up conquering Crete, humbling Venice. His brother-in-law, Ahmed, had defeated the Polish-Lithuanian king, John Sobieski, had taken over a new province. It was incumbent on him to do the same in the family tradition, and that is to capture Austria. And therefore, on April 1st, 1683, essentially the Ottoman state declared war on the Habsburgs, even though the truce was supposedly still in effect. The result was a vast mobilization of forces. On April 1st, 1683, the Sultan and his Grand Vizier both left Constantinople with a grand fanfare, heading to the city of Belgrade, which I mentioned was always the staging point for any operation into the northwest. Along the way, various Timurids were summoned, and the best evidence suggests that there was a very, very full levy. Probably some 50 to 60,000 men owed military service for holding these Timars. There was also the levying of large numbers of irregular forces. These are often known as Lavandlar, or sometimes they're known as Sekaban forces. They're essentially mercenaries or militia that were taken on the Sultan's payroll in expeditions. And incidentally, that word Sekban, which means a mercenary soldier, eventually was turned into the word sepoy by the British, who encountered a version of that term in northern India in the 18th century. The Tatars of the Crimean Khanate were summoned. They came in force. It was also expected that large number of Hungarian soldiers would appear. And sure enough, Imre Thököly appeared with the full Hungarian levy. It was probably the greatest army that had been mobilized in a generation and a half. And the Sultan stopped at Belgrade and entrusted the overall direction of the campaign to his very, very aggressive Grand Vizier. Now, in later traditions, Kara Mustafa has been condemned as overly ambitious, as ineffective, and he did make certain mistakes in the final battle. But his overall policy was hardly out of line with traditional Ottoman aims. And furthermore, the mobilization of these forces for a grand attack on Vienna really showed how efficiently the Ottoman state was operating. One of the great achievements of the Kapurli administration was to put in effective officials. And as far as we can tell, in 1683, the enormous logistical demands, the grain, which would have been delivered from Wallachia and Moldavia, the kind of pack animals necessary to move all this equipment some 950 miles from Constantinople, was all done with complete efficiency and apparently without too much disruption of the local population. Undoubtedly, there were instances of requisitioning, illegal seizing of stock animals and grain, but on the whole, the expedition went off very smoothly. There were, however, some problems, and that again was the unseasonable rains they encountered. And unfortunately for the Ottoman army, en route from Belgrade to Buda, many of the heavy siege guns were abandoned. And when the Ottoman army finally settled down to a siege on July 14th, 1683, they were actually considerably outgunned by the garrison. The garrison probably had 3 times the artillery that the Ottoman force had. And that proved very, very significant in that 2-month siege. When the Ottoman army appeared before Vienna, Vienna had changed considerably from 1529. In 1532, the city had been extremely small, maybe 50,000 residents. Those of you familiar with the city of Vienna, the city walls would have correspond to today what is called Der Ring. The walls have long since been removed, and essentially it's park decorations. That's a development of the later 18th century. The city had expanded. It was heavily fortified, and it was fortified with the state-of-the-art fortifications that would be characterized as the Italian system that was then later reinvented by Vauban into the great Vauban fortresses of the 17th and 18th century. So it could mount significant amount of artillery. There was also a professional force there, commanded by able officers, and when the city was put under siege, it was able to hold out despite artillery bombardment and constant mining operations. Meanwhile, Leopold I had fled Vienna, had relocated to the Holy Roman Empire, and he launched an appeal to the princes of Germany to send forces, both the Protestant and the Catholic princes, and remarkably, they responded. The Habsburg army gathered at Linz. It was put under the command of Duke Charles V of Lorraine, a very, very capable commander who had a long record behind him. And above all, the fellow monarch, John Sobieski, who had been elected the King of Poland and had fought Ottoman armies in Polonia less than a decade ago, raised the Polish and Lithuanian forces. And while it took a long time for the GEM, that is the Polish and Lithuanian parliaments, to vote sufficient forces, the forces did arrive and eventually concentrated at Linz and moved in tandem together to relieve the siege. Mustafa, from all previous wars with the Christians, cannot be faulted for underestimating both the size of the Christian forces or their unity. This was all out of proportion and beyond expectation given previous wars with the Habsburgs. The second important point about Mustafa is apparently there was faulty intelligence reports. And this was largely the result of the Hungarian and the Tatar allies coming bored with the siege. There wasn't enough booty. There weren't any women around. Austria had been evacuated. Royal Hungary had been evacuated. And many of them had gone home. And so Mustafa had very, very inaccurate reports about the Christian forces that were approaching. Just days before that army showed up on the 12th of September, 1683, the mining operations had finally succeeded. The Ottomans always were superb engineers. They blew out a major section of the wall, and Mustafa realized the prize was almost there. He ordered a general assault on September 12th, headed up by the Janissaries, to capture the city that had defied him for 2 months and had defied previous armies of Suleiman the Magnificent. The assault went underway. But meanwhile, the Christian Relief Army had appeared to the northwest and had occupied the high hills to the northwest of the city, and immediately the Christian infantry advanced and fired a murderous musket artillery fire onto the Ottoman camp. Mustafa launched his cavalry, his Timurats, and the household cavalry of the Janissaries against the Christian forces, and a major battle ensued in which the Ottomans were stunned because this is the first time they ran into the infantry based on pike and musket that had been perfected in the 30 Years' War. The Ottomans were unaware of these military developments, and the battle became extremely uneven as the Janissaries were fighting their way into the city. The defenders holed up in the center to make the last stand, and John Sobieski arrived at the crucial point, launched his 3,000 Polish hussars, the greatest heavy cavalry in Europe, backed up by another 13,000 cavalry in what is the largest cavalry charge on record. And it smashed through the Ottoman camp, destroyed the Timurat cavalry. The Janissaries were cut off and cut down in the city. It was a military catastrophe. Mustafa managed to get away. He made his way back to Belgrade and, of course, was summarily executed by being strangled, and Mehmed IV could put the blame on his Grand Vizier. But the defeat at Vienna was a crucial turning point. For the first time since the Battle of Angora, an Ottoman imperial army had simply disappeared. What was more dangerous was new tactics and weapons on the battlefield had appeared that had changed the balance decisively to the Habsburg armies, and it led to a new war in the next year, 1684, a new coalition. Now, the Pope, Innocent XI, would claim it would be a Holy League, but it's really the first European coalition against the Ottoman state that would put together Poland, Lithuania, the Habsburg Empire, Venice, and Russia in a grand coalition to take out the Ottoman state. And the result is the Ottoman army found itself not only on the defensive, but on the retreat.